The wind howled through the pines, whipping through the darkened forest like a warning whispered by unseen specters. Eleanor Whitmore ran, her breath ragged, her boots sinking into the damp earth with each desperate step. Her dress, once an elegant ivory, now clung to her in tatters, streaked with mud and blood, neither entirely her own. The weight of exhaustion clawed at her, but the fear surging through her veins forced her forward. Behind her, in the distance, the sound of hooves drummed against the ground, steady, relentless. Isaac Blackwood was close. Too close. A flash of silver moonlight revealed a break in the trees ahead, a clearing that could lead to the river. If she reached it, she might find a way to hide, to throw them off her trail. The thought of capture, of his hands on her again, sent ice-cold terror through her chest. She gritted her teeth, pressed a hand against the shallow wound on her arm, where a tree branch had torn through her skin, and ran faster. A gunshot cracked through the night. Bark exploded from a tree inches from her head. Eleanor gasped, stumbling forward but catching herself before she fell. Isaac's voice followed, dark amusement curling through his words. "Keep running, Eleanor. You know I enjoy the chase." The voice was closer than she expected. Too close. She swallowed a sob, pushing herself harder, ignoring the burn in her lungs. She wouldn't let him take her. She couldn't. The river appeared suddenly before her, its dark waters rushing violently, swollen from recent rains. Her mind raced. Crossing in the dead of night in her state was suicide, but staying meant facing Isaac. She spun, scanning the darkness for movement, her ears straining against the roar of the current. Silence. Then, another gunshot. It struck the ground at her feet, kicking up dirt and stone. She turned and plunged into the water, without another thought. The cold was a brutal shock, seizing her muscles, stealing her breath, but she forced herself onward. The current pulled at her, dragging her beneath the surface. She fought, her arms flailing against the force of it, but it was too strong. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was the shadowed figure of Isaac standing at the riverbank, watching. Pain woke her. A deep, dull ache radiated from her ribs, her limbs heavy as if she had been buried beneath stone. She gasped, coughing up water, her fingers clawing at damp earth. She was alive. Somehow, the river had spit her out onto a bank of reeds, her body battered but intact. Blinking against the early morning light filtering through the trees, she forced herself onto her hands and knees. The world swayed around her, the aftereffect of exhaustion and fear still thick in her blood. Her dress was torn beyond recognition, her skin bruised and scraped raw. She had nothing, not food, not shelter, and worst of all, no idea where she was. She tried to stand, but a wave of dizziness sent her back to her knees. The memory of Isaac's voice echoed in her mind, a phantom whisper curling around her throat. He wouldn't stop, not until he had her under his thumb again. A rustling in the trees snapped her from her thoughts. Her heart pounded. Slowly, she turned her head, her breath catching when she saw the figure standing at the edge of clearing. A man. He was tall, his form lean but powerful, his long black hair falling loose over his shoulders. His eyes, dark and unreadable, studied her in silence. He wore the traditional garb of a Comanche warrior. Fringed leggings, a belt adorned with bone and stone, a quiver of arrows slung over his shoulder. His bow was in his hand, though not raised. Not yet. Eleanor's pulse thundered. She had heard stories. White settlers spoke of the Comanche as ruthless raiders, merciless and wild. But as she looked at him, at the way he stood, still observant, his expression neither cruel nor kind, she realized she had no idea what to expect. She swallowed, forcing herself to speak despite the rawness in her throat. "Please," she rasped. I need help." He didn't move, didn't speak. His gaze flicked to the river, then back to her, assessing. She didn't know if he understood her, but she pressed on. "There's a man hunting me. He'll kill me." At that, something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there, a flicker of recognition, a knowing. Still, he said nothing. Instead, he turned and disappeared into the trees. Eleanor's breath caught. "No, wait." She lurched forward, but the sudden movement sent pain shooting through her side. She gasped, collapsing onto her hands. When she looked up again, he was gone. Panic welled in her chest. She was alone. She forced herself to breathe, to think. The river had given her temporary safety, but Isaac wouldn't be far behind. She needed to move, needed to find shelter or food, anything to keep going. Using the last of her strength, she pushed herself to her feet. The forest loomed before her, vast and indifferent. She had no choice but to walk into it. With one final glance over her shoulder, toward the place where the warrior had stood, she turned and disappeared into the trees. The scent of smoke was the first thing Eleanor noticed when she woke. It was faint but unmistakable, curling to the damp air like a lingering breath from a dying fire. Her body ached, the bruises deepening overnight, her muscles stiff from exposure. As she forced herself upright, she became aware of another presence. He was there, the warrior. He sat a short distance away, crouched beside a small fire, his hand steady as he turned a skinned rabbit over the flames. He did not look at her, but she knew he was aware of her every movement. Her mind reeled, trying to piece together how she had gotten here. The last thing she remembered was staggering through the woods, each step an act of sheer will, before the exhaustion overtook her. Had he followed her? Had he carried her here? Her throat was raw when she finally spoke. "You helped me." The warrior remained silent, his expression unreadable. He tore a strip of meat from the rabbit and ate, his movements deliberate, patient. She licked her cracked lips, the hunger clawing at her insides, making her lightheaded. Still, he did not offer food. It was a test, she realized, a silent challenge. He would not treat her as helpless, nor would he force her to take what she did not ask for. Swallowing her pride, she spoke again. "May I have some?" Only then did he look at her. His dark eyes searched hers before he reached into the small pile of cooked meat and handed her a portion. She took it carefully, whispering, "Thank you." The first bite was heaven, warmth spreading through her as she chewed slowly, savoring every bit. She had never eaten like this before. Food stripped of refinement, of plates and silver, taken directly from fire to hand. And yet, in that moment, nothing had ever tasted better. They sat in silence, the quiet stretching between them, filled only by the distant rustling of trees. Eventually, she found her voice again. "What's your name?" For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "Tahu." The single word felt like a stone dropping into still water. She nodded, letting the name settle in her mind. "I'm Eleanor." Tahu said nothing, but she thought she saw the faintest flicker of acknowledgement in his expression. The fire crackled softly as she forced herself to ask the next question. "Why did you help me?" This time, his gaze did not waver. He studied her, his face unreadable, before finally saying, "I saw your eyes." She frowned. "My eyes." "You were not running towards something." He tore another strip of meat, his voice even measured. "You were running from something." A lump formed in her throat. He had seen her, truly seen her, in a way that unsettled her more than Isaac ever had. She lowered her gaze. "Yes." Tao did not press her further, but she knew he understood more than he let on. Time passed in quiet companionship. The fire dwindled, the sun slipping lower in the sky. Eleanor's body still ached, but the food had given her strength. Tahu stood abruptly, slinging his bow over his shoulder. "Come." She blinked, startled. "Where?" He didn't answer, only gestured for her to follow before disappearing into the trees. For a brief moment, she hesitated. She had no reason to trust him, and yet she had no choice. Gritting her teeth, she pushed herself up and followed. The forest swallowed them whole, its towering trees casting long shadows across the earth. Tahu moved like a phantom, his steps soundless, his presence blending seamlessly with the wild. Eleanor struggled to keep pace, each step a reminder of her injuries, but she refused to fall behind. They walked for what felt like hours, deeper into the wilderness. At last, they arrived at a small clearing where a stream cut through the land, its waters clear and swift. Tahu knelt by the bank, cupping his hands and drinking deeply before motioning for her to do the same. She hesitated only a moment before kneeling beside him, scooping the cool water into her palms. As she drank, she became aware of him watching her, not with suspicion, nor with judgment, simply watching. "You are not meant for this land," he said finally. The words stung, though she knew they were true. "I never had to survive on my own before." Tahu nodded, as if he had already known her answer. "Then you must learn." He rose and moved toward a tree, breaking off a thin branch. With careful precision, he pulled a knife from his belt and began stripping the bark, whittling it into a sharp point. He tossed it to her. "Fine food." She caught it awkwardly, looking at him in disbelief. "You expect me to hunt?" He said nothing. She exhaled sharply, looking around at the dense forest. She had never hunted in her life, but if she wanted to survive, she had no other choice. Determined, she turned and disappeared into the trees. The hours that followed were filled with failure. The first rabbit she spotted darted away before she could even get close. The second time, she hesitated, her hands shaking too much to throw the makeshift spear. Frustration burned in her chest, her stomach growling angrily. She could not fail. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself. She crouched lower, waiting, listening. A rustle in the brush, a flicker of movement, a rabbit, smaller than the last, but within reach. She threw. The spear struck true. Her breath caught as the rabbit collapsed, still and unmoving. For a long moment, she stared, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had done it. A presence at her back startled her. She turned to find Tahu watching, silent as ever. He nodded once, approval, recognition. Something settled in Eleanor's chest, a quiet understanding between them. That night, as the fire burned low, they ate together once more. Tahu spoke first. "Your hands no longer shake." She glanced down, flexing her fingers. He was right. She met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. For the first time since she had fled, Eleanor felt something other than fear. She felt the stirrings of strength. The wind carried the scent of smoke and blood. Eleanor could taste it on the air, acrid and sharp, mixing with the sweat on her skin. She crouched behind a tangle of brush, her breath coming in slow, measured draws, fingers tight around the knife Tahu had given her. She had never wielded a weapon before, never needed to, but now her life depended on it. The moon was high, casting silver light across the clearing where the trees thinned, and the earth lay trampled by boot prints. A campfire flickered, its glow illuminating the dark figures gathered around it. 4 men, maybe 5, and at the center of them, seated like a king among his hounds, was Isaac Blackwood. He hadn't changed. His blonde hair was still neatly combed despite the filth of the trail, his fine coat a stark contrast to the rugged wilderness around him. But his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were sharper than ever. She clenched her jaw against a wave of nausea that rose in her gut. He had found her. Tahu knelt beside her, silent as the shadows that stretched between the trees. His presence was steady, unwavering. He had led her this far, guided her when she had nothing but fear to hold on to. Now, he watched the scene below with the patience of a predator, his bow resting lightly in his hands, an arrow already nocked. Eleanor swallowed hard. "They have horses," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Weapons." Tahu's gaze flicked to hers. "So do we?" Her fingers tightened around the knife. She wasn't ready. Not for this. But she had no choice. Isaac's voice rang out, sharp and sure. "Eleanor." She flinched, every muscle in her body locking. He wasn't looking at her. He couldn't see her, but his voice slithered through the night, confident, knowing. "I know you're near," he continued, his tone calm, almost amused. "You never were very good at hiding." He lifted a silver flask to his lips, took a slow sip, then smiled. "Come now, darling. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." One of the men chuckled. "Think she's got herself lost?" "No," Isaac said. "She has help." Eleanor's breath caught. "She's always been stubborn," he mused, rolling the flask between his fingers. Always wanted to believe she was stronger than she was. He sighed. But we both know the truth, don't we, Eleanor? Her fingers trembled. You can run, you can fight, but in the end, you belong to me. A chill crawled down her spine. Tahu moved then. So quietly she barely noticed, shifting to position himself between her and the clearing. His fingers tensed against the bowstring, the arrow steady. Eleanor turned to him, her heart hammering. He won't stop. Tahu didn't look at her. His gaze locked on the men below. Then neither will we. A beat of silence. Then Tahu rose. Before she could stop him, before she could even process what was happening, he stepped into the moonlight. The men reacted instantly, hands flying to their guns, bodies coiling like snakes ready to strike. Isaac, however, only smiled. Well, now, he drawled, tilting his head. This is interesting. Tahu stood tall, his expression unreadable, the firelight flickering against his bronze skin. His bow was drawn, the arrow aimed directly at Isaac's heart. Isaac chuckled, slow and lazy. You've got spirit, I'll give you that. He gestured to his men. But I think you'll find her outnumbered. No one moved. The air was thick with the weight of waiting. Then, in a flash, Tahu loosed the arrow. It struck one of Isaac's men before he could draw his pistol, burying deep into his shoulder. The man let out a strangled yell. Stumbling backward, chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked through the night. Eleanor bolted from the underbrush, her knife clutched tight, her feet moving before her mind could catch up. Tahu moved like a ghost, weaving between the trees, arrows flying from his bow with deadly precision. Another man fell, clutching his throat, gurgling. Isaac remained seated, watching, his expression cool, unmoved. Then, with a slow, almost deliberate motion, he rose to his feet. Eleanor barely had time to react before he reached for his gun. She lunged. Her blade found flesh, slicing across his forearm as he raised the pistol. He cursed, staggering back, but recovered quickly. Feisty, he hissed, gripping his wounded arm. I always liked that about you. She swung again, but he caught her wrist, twisting sharply. Pain lanced through her, and she cried out, the knife slipping from her grasp. Isaac yanked her close, his breath hot against her ear. You really thought you could win? A blur of movement. Tahu was there. He struck like a storm, his knife flashing in the firelight, slicing across Isaac's side. Isaac roared, releasing Eleanor as he stumbled back. Tahu didn't hesitate. He drove his blade deep into Isaac's thigh, forcing him to his knees. Blood darkened the ground beneath him. Isaac gasped, his fingers clutching at his leg. His eyes, once so sure, flickered with something unfamiliar. Fear. Eleanor picked up her fallen knife, stepping forward. Her breath was unsteady, her hands shaking, but she didn't waver. Isaac looked up at her, his lips curling into a bloody sneer. Go on, then. His voice was hoarse, but still laced with arrogance. Do it. Her fingers tightened around the hilt. She could end it here. The world seemed to hold its breath. Tahu watched her, his face unreadable, but he did not interfere. This was her choice. For the first time, she truly understood what that meant. Slowly, she exhaled, and then she stepped back. Isaac laughed, low and bitter. Pathetic. Tahu moved in an instant, his fist slamming into Isaac's temple. The man crumpled, unconscious. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Tahu knelt, checking the rise and fall of Isaac's chest before meeting her gaze. He will live. A beat, but he will never hunt you again. She swallowed hard, nodding. The night stretched around them, the weight of what had passed settling like dust after a storm. Eleanor turned her eyes to the horizon. She had spent so long running, so long fearing. But now, for the first time in her life, she was free, and she would decide what came next.